Welcome to the world of neurosurgery. This unit is pretty sizable, so do your best to study it in chunks and not all in one go. Let's get started. Neurosurgery focuses on the disease and disorders of the brain, spine, and peripheral nerves. The nervous system is the body's communication center, responsible for receiving, processing, and interpreting information, which it then coordinates the appropriate response. We could go on for days about all the decisions your nervous system makes for you, and yet we wouldn't be even close to covering all of them. We will be covering a wide variety of procedures and body tissues, so we need to understand that in order to access these structures, we'll need setups comprised of soft tissue and orthopedic instrumentation. More on that later, though. The anatomy we'll be covering in this unit is complex. Take it from me, you will want to access additional resources. Remember, Memler's is a great resource, as is Netter's textbook that I have in my office, which you are welcome to look at while you're on campus. We'll start off with the structural parts of the nervous system. The entire nervous system is comprised of two specialized systems. They are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is composed of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is all the cranial and spinal nerves and their branches. It's very important to understand that when studying these systems, you don't confuse the spinal cord with the spinal nerves, because they're not the same thing. The spinal nerves branch off the spinal cord and travel throughout our whole body, receiving information constantly and transmitting it back to the spinal cord for interpretation. In all these nerves is a primary cell type called the neuron. Each one of us has millions of neurons in our body. Every single neuron has three distinct parts. The image on your screen shows a single neuron. The green oval on the left side of the screen is the soma. The soma is the cell body. It's responsible for sending and receiving nerve impulses. It's the energy center for the cell. I find it impressive that such a small portion of the microscopic cell has that much responsibility. The purple spiky part surrounding the soma is the dendrite. The dendrite is a portion of the cell that is picking up nerve impulses and delivering them to the soma. If you can imagine a network of millions of these little guys, every dendrite is like a TMZ photographer looking for the next bit of juicy information it can spread to the world. In this case, the dendrite's world is the soma. After the soma has received its juicy gossip from the dendrite photographer, it sends the information on via the axon, which in this image begins at that first yellow oval attached to the dendrite. Everything from that oval off to the right is the axon. The axon carries whatever message the soma tells it to away from the cell. Axon, away. In that network we mentioned a second ago, envision in your head millions of these guys in our body, within our brain, our spinal cord, our cranial nerves, our spinal nerves, and every axon is carrying a message which has been picked up by the next dendrite. That dendrite gives the message to the soma sends it to the axon, and so the cycle continues over and over and over. We're going to spend a fair amount of time covering the various anatomical structures of the skull, brain, spine, and spinal cord in these videos. The skull, otherwise known as the cranium, covers our brain and protects it. It is comprised of 6 bones total. Those bones are the frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, 2 temporal bones, and 1 occipital bone. You have a right and a left parietal bone, and you have a right and a left temporal bone. The other bones and landmarks identified on this image are not considered bones of the cranium, and although you've successfully survived both the ophthalmic and oral and maxillofacial units, all three of these specialties share bones from the mandible up. And I don't want you to forget what you've learned. So here is a list of bones that make up the bony orbit. Add to that the list of bones to the facial skeleton, and finally, the bones of the skull. The soft tissue covering the skull is created. The soft tissue covering the skull is called the scalp, and it is extremely vascular. The scalp will bleed profusely when cut, which is a significant concern for the surgical technologist. The ST must be prepared with the appropriate instrumentation, supplies, and hemostatic agents. Between our scalp and skull is the pericranium, and it is covered by muscle and a tough fibrous sheet called galea. The 6 bones of the skull are connected by a thin membrane called a suture, and these are considered synarthrosis joints. Below our skull, we find the layers that further protect our brain, known as the meninges. The meninges are found underneath the periosteum, beginning with the outermost layer, the dura mater. The dura mater consists of very dense fibrous tissue. Below the dura mater is the arachnoid mater. As you can imagine, using the term arachnoid as a label for this layer can help you remember that it is kind of spiderweb-like. Below the arachnoid mater is the pia mater, which is the softest layer of the 3, and it lies directly on top of the brain and dips down into the various crevices and convolutions of the brain. You should have noticed that all 3 layers include the term mater in them, and it's worthy to note that mater is Latin for mother, and so you can kind of think of it like the mater protects the brain like a mother protects a child. This next slide will briefly cover the sections of the brain. Be aware, Fuller describes the brain as 3 sections, and Memler's describes it in 4 sections. We're going to lean towards Memler's description over Fuller this time because the diencephalon is a very important structure, and I don't want you losing track of it by combining it with the brainstem like Fuller does. So, the first section is the cerebrum. It comprises the vast majority of the brain tissue. Another name for it is the forebrain. We will go over what the cerebrum actually does for us in a couple of slides from now. Behind and below the cerebrum, under the skull's occipital bone, is the cerebellum. Another name for the cerebellum is the hindbrain. A common area of confusion takes place right about here, differentiating between the brainstem and the diencephalon. The diencephalon gives rise between the cerebral hemispheres. It is superior to the brainstem, but inferior to the cerebrum. In layman's terms, that means it's between the cerebrum and brainstem. The diencephalon is comprised of several endocrine glands known as the thalamus, pineal gland, the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and the hypothalamus. And we'll go over what those glands do for us really soon. The final section of the brain is the brainstem, which is further divided into 3 important sections: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain communicates directly with the diencephalon, hence why many consider the 2 to be the same structure. But the aforementioned endocrine glands are in the diencephalon, and the midbrain transmits their messages. No glands live in the midbrain. That's why we are separating it out. Below the midbrain is the pons. The pons is primarily white matter, and white matter is a collection of millions of myelinated nerve fibers that transmit messages between all the neurons in our nervous system. Because you understand that neurons are constantly seeking and receiving and sending information between themselves, you can appreciate that the pons is doing just that between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. The third and final section of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. The medulla is the continuation of the pons to the spinal cord. At this point, the tissue changes from mainly white matter to mostly gray matter. Gray matter is unlike white matter in that the neurons that comprise the gray matter are focused more on processing information as opposed to transmitting it. The neurons look a little different here too, but thankfully we don't really have to focus on that. What we do have to focus on is that the medulla is the transition point between all white matter in the pons to mostly gray matter in the spinal cord, and all impulses into and out of the spinal cord occur here. The medulla is also the central location for our autonomic functions such as your circulatory, respiratory, and cardiac systems, which we will start to study in just a couple of weeks. These divisions of the normal brain work together constantly in seamless fashion to regulate body functions.